is going to be very excited. But for now, Shelley, could you do the roll call or the attendance list like when we are in high school?
Barry Abrahams.
Present.
Wendy Clark. Heidi DeWinger. Kylie Goslin. Tim Hodges. Steve Kitowitz.
Here.
Catherine McKinnon.
Here.
Salem Mascaro Bruno.
Here.
George Perez.
Here.
Franklin Perry. Sarah Sanders.
Here.
Jared Schmidt. Lisa Temper Bates.
Here.
Gwendolyn Thames.
Present.
And Greg Ugalde.
Present.
Thank you,
Hi, this
Shelley.
is Heidi. I just joined late. Sorry.
Okay, thank you.
Wendy Clark's on as well.
Great.
Oh, great. Thank you. I hope everybody had a nice long weekend. But I always think that today is Monday. So here we go. We have two items on the agenda. One is the resolution to modify the agreement that we have with the Department of Housing on the temporary rental assistance program. So Hazin, could you please present the resolution?
Sure. So good afternoon, Madam Chair and members of the board. On June 25th, the board approved a resolution to permit CHFA to administer the state temporary housing assistance program. The program provides the availability of $10 million for qualified renters and $10 million for qualified homeowners who were or are impacted by COVID-19. Since that time, and due to the overwhelming need by renters, the state has increased the funding for rental assistance by $30 million. In connection with this increase and the need to deploy the federal funds by December 31st, we are seeking to amend the prior resolution and the MOU with the Department of Housing to modify the renter program criteria and the administrative budget, and to permit CHFA to help process existing and future renter applications. I will be happy to answer any questions the board may have about the amendment.
Thank you, Hazin. Questions for Hazin? Can I have a motion to approve the resolution?
So moved.
I'll second that.
You got that, Shelley?
Yeah, I have a question. This is George.
Yeah.
What does this
Go
mean?
ahead, George.
What does this mean for CHFA? I mean, staff-wise, time, commitment. Can we talk about that?
Yeah, so that's part of the whole process to ensure that the state is able to spend the federal funds by December 31st and trying to get the proceeds to the renters as soon as possible. CHFA has allocated about 30 staff. What they're doing right now is staff will be spending at least half of each day to review the application and to expedite and get the documentation so that we can push the payments to the landlords.
I understand what we're trying to do, and I support it. But that's not my question. My question is, what would be the impact on the everyday operation of CHFA? Is it because of the COVID-19 things are slow and we can do it without any additional staff? Is it going to require additional staff?
Right now, we are not considering additional staff. So before we set aside or identify the staff, one of the things that what we did internally was to identify processes, availability of staff, ability of processes.
So the answer is there's no impact on the operations of CHEF at this point.
Yes, it does not impact CHEF's operation at this point.
Okay, that was my question. That's it. I understand the goal and I support the goal. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Shelley, could you do the roll call, please?
Yes. Jerry Abrahams,
Aye.
Wendy Clark,
Aye.
Heidi DeWinger,
Aye.
Kyla Goslin, Tim Hodges.
Aye.
Oh, you are. Steve Kitowitz,
Aye.
Catherine McKinnon,
Aye.
Sal Mascaro Bruno,
Yes.
George Perez,
Yes.
Franklin Perry,
Yes.
Sarah Sanders,
Aye.
Lisa Tepper Bates,
Yes.
Gwendolyn Thames,
Yes.
Greg Ugalde.
Aye.
Unanimous.
Motion carries. Thank you, Shelley. The second item on the agenda is the presentation and discussion on CHFA's capital structure. It's a study that was done by two outside consultants, and I will let Nandini to introduce them. But what I want to just say to the new board members, in October, we usually at the board meeting, we will have the draft budget for approval as well as the lending plan for this coming year. So this is actually an opportunity for all of us to understand the structure, the capital structure, and why staff looks at the plan and how they come out with a plan, so we can understand a little more, have the time to understand a little more than what presented just with numbers and a plan. So I'm gonna have Nandini to introduce our two consultants.
Great. Thank you, Commissioner. Good afternoon, board members. Great to see you all virtually. I'm very pleased to introduce to you two experts in the field of housing finance, Jean Slater and Tim Rittenhouse from CSG Advisors. The firm and both Jean and Tim are noted experts in this field. They've assisted over 25 state housing finance agencies with their financial plans, their capital adequacy analyses, and have been involved in over $90 billion of housing revenue bond structurings since the firm's inception. So back in June, if you can recall, we had discussed CHFA undertaking a study to analyze its resources in light of the continuing and increasing demand for affordable housing, both in single family and multifamily. And the question was asked, how can CHFA do more given its current resources, given the demand for increased resources, shortage of state funds, et cetera, and stay financially sustainable and maintain financial flexibility. And so with that in mind, we retained CSG Advisors, and in the last 2 or 3 months, we've been working with them diligently, meeting with them every week. Special thanks go out to Hazim Taib and his team, who provided a significant backup and support from a data perspective for this study, which is a huge lift for them, as well as the heads of single family and multifamily, Valencia Tapp Jackson and Masuda Omar, who have also weighed in on some of the proposals that Jean will talk about today. So with that, I will turn it over to Jean Slater.
Thank you very much. Can everybody hear me? Thank you.
Yes.
Yes.
So let me just start with the table of contents. I assume everybody both has their own, but I'll use using screen sharing. So what I want to talk about first is sort of what is the purpose and approach that's involved, then lay out a financial framework of how to think about CHFA and its resources, and some revisions to that, including how that relates to ratings and the balance sheet, to risk, and to net annual income, which is, you'll see, is the key to all the things you can do in the future. And then talk about ways to put that to use in terms of home ownership and multifamily, with specific proposals, both long-term and that would affect potentially this year's financing plan, and with a criteria, a set of criteria checklists that we've been using with other HFAs for making major decisions. So I'll pause at the end of every section to make certain that people have questions, so don't worry. I expect this to be a vigorous discussion. So in terms of purpose, so the aim of this work is really to support your current strategic planning effort by identifying resources, by creating transparency about the different resources you have and how they can be used, to provide money that can fund new programs or expanding programs while maintaining the financial sustainability of the agency. I'll come back to what I think that means. And how to create these mechanisms that can operate in a world of uncertainty. If anything, this year has taught us how much uncertainty we deal with in housing finance as well as in everything else. So how do we establish a framework that operates given uncertainty? So what is a strategic capital analysis? The aim is to take into account both your current and future requirements, look at how those are affected by different kinds of risks, what's the availability of capital to meet your needs, and then most important, this is what we found from doing these studies, is what is the financial flexibility of the agency to deal with future challenges? That really becomes, even more than your net worth, really becomes sort of the key resource we've learned from doing these studies for other states. And the aim is to provide a clear understanding that's both internally for the staff, for the board, for stakeholders, a shared understanding of your different components, how they affect each other, how the decisions you make over here, you're designing a new program, you're issuing new bonds, how do these affect each other? So the aim is to provide an ongoing financial framework and systematic criteria for helping make those decisions. That's really the purpose of this at the broadest level. And why is this useful or necessary or valuable for state HFAs? The answer, and we've been doing these studies, we did the first of these for Virginia in 2002, and then we did Colorado and California and Minnesota and so forth over many years. And the answer we've learned is that the focus of the staff, of board, of everybody, housing is an opportunity-driven business, so the focus is inevitably on day-to-day actions, which in some ways makes the need for a longer framework, a longer perspective of how they fit together, not less important, but more important. Individual decisions are usually made separately. Decisions on, the budget, decisions on let's do a new bond program, let's reduce down payment assistance, let's finance this over here. And so what's hard to see in that is how do these things affect each other cumulatively? And in many ways, the purpose of this study is to look at the combined cumulative impacts. Let me just throw my example. So the other thing that's happened is particularly true over the last 15 or 20 years. Housing finance agencies such as CHAFA have become increasingly more complicated. Multiple programs, much more complex financings, variable rate debt. They're more dynamic financially. Things you do over here affect decisions you're making there, with multiple lines of business and many different kinds of risks. And at the same time, the financial statements, that Hazim prepares, and the rating agency reports are helpful, but inevitably they're static, and they're backward. They look backwards at what have been the impacts of things to date, not what are the potential impacts of the decisions you're making going forward. So the result of this is that it's much harder for HFAs, both at the staff and board level, to see how the programs and finances are interconnected. And so therefore, what this leads to is the value of an approach which is comprehensive, which looks at the agency as a whole, which is systematic, which looks not only backward, but also forward, and makes projections. If you continue doing what you're doing, where is that going to lead you? And looks at that impact. takes into account risks, and does that by, the way we've done this, is by sensitivity analyses. We don't know what the future is going to be, so we've looked at different scenarios that lay out reasonable cases, bad and good, high rates and low rates, within which uncertainty may happen, to say, what would be the consequences if we do that? And it focuses on how the program choices and the financing choices interact, how they affect each other. So as I said, here are some of the states that we've worked on with these studies, and what they've used them for is informing, like multi-year strategic plans. You're developing a 3-year strategic plan, so we've designed this analysis around, projections over the next 3 years. Where does that put you starting in 2024? To provide a tool for analyzing major decisions, to help inform stakeholders of what you can do and what's hard for you to do. And probably most important here, coming up in your upcoming meetings, is providing a framework, a broader framework within which you can make budgeting, financing decisions, and investment decisions for strategic priorities in a way that you can see the impact, what the impacts of those will be, rather than view them one by one. So the aim is really to help inform discussions, fundamental board and staff questions. This kind of study, I think, from our work with you, has been is especially useful given the close relationship between the agency and the state, the Department of Housing, in terms of how resources. So stepping back and seeing how these things fit together, how they can be work together, becomes more important. And finally, one other reason it's been hard, I think, for transparency or to see all the interconnections of CAFA is that all the resources are managed under a single bond resolution. Most agencies have a separate general fund, and they look at that and they say, okay, we have these resources separate from our indenture. We can make those decisions. Here, almost all the resources are bound up in a single document that's very complicated, and it's made clarity difficult for everybody about what choices you have. So let me now just describe the sort of approach we've taken, and then I'll pause for questions on this overview. So our aim was to create a financial framework of the agency as a whole, of all its different components and its multiple lines of business. We looked at recent trends from 2017 through 2020 annualized. We worked off the June 30th figures with input from Hazim about what things are likely to change in the last part of the year. We've done this on a cash basis, not an accounting basis. So we're looking at actual, cash revenues and expenses. We've tried to adjust for risks. By risks, I mean both the risks the rating agencies assess, but also a sort of management case, a more reasonable set of risks that we've analyzed. And then we've tried to project, if you can keep making the same decisions you're making, or you make these changes we've proposed in structure, where are you likely to be 3 years from now, sort of the study period. And we've looked at that we've looked at both rating agency analyses of that, and also more reasonable management case studies, in which we've looked at your projected net worth less the risks the rating agencies assess, which is sort of your risk-adjusted capital. How much of that is needed to be used for future financial sustainability? What's the likely range of expected annual income? And what's a good basis for determining how much can be invested in strategic priorities? And one of the key focuses you'll see is future annual net income. So there are two key ideas here, or three ideas. It's a capital structure within which decisions are made. It's how do you maintain or increase income over, given uncertainty, and how do you deal with risk, and how do those things relate to each other in creating a transparent framework for the agency. On page 9, this just shows we've created 3 scenarios. So these are the study scenarios. a low rate, and as rates stay pretty low, I mean, they're now at historic lows, so they only increase a little over the next 3 years. Probably likely what's going to happen given Fed actions. What happens if rates go higher and in the future go even higher? And then we've added a stress, and then we've added a stress scenario which takes into account what if the COVID-related losses are larger than we are currently assuming. We have loan losses that are larger. The spread, what the agency earns on its bonds, turns out to be narrower than we hope. There's a sort of worst case scenario. This doesn't mean this is the full range of everything that can happen, but it's a reasonable case. So we've tried to take these different scenarios and show what happens under each of these, so you have a range of what may happen, so you can make decisions with some level of comfort that you're within that range. So why don't I stop here and take any questions about the overall purpose or the approach we're trying to take. Nobody? Okay. We'll get into stuff where I'm sure you'll have questions. So now I'm going to turn to the financial framework, in particular to this idea of a capital structure. So the central question that drives the analysis we've done is, how do you operate the agency and make decisions in a cumulative way that 3 years from now, you will be able to do more rather than less? And to me, that's an important question because it unites the agency's financial capacity, its resources, its sustainability, its ability to pay its bills, its ability to cover its risks. It unites that together with your ability to expand and do more programmatically in terms of mission. It puts those on the same side of the table. That question puts those on the same side of the table, because it's essential. If you're going to be able to do more programmatically, you have to be sustainable. And it views these proactively as, how do we put ourselves in a position where, rather than doing everything we can this year and then we can't do anything several years from now, what will be the impacts? We actually, just historically, 15 years ago, we did this analysis for California at a time when they were taking on enormous amounts of variable rate debt. We basically told them they needed to stop doing what they were doing, because it would put them in a position in which their programs would shut down. And that's, in fact, after the recession, what happened. They basically didn't take our advice. All the other clients we've worked with have had. This isn't meant as a warning, but it's simply this, how important financial capacity is for the long run to be able to expand the programmatic things that you want to do, and to view these not as opposite objectives, but how do we link these together? And so we've looked at, to then look at that question, that notion of, that's what I mean by sustainability. To look at that question, we've looked at resources, constraints, risks, financial flexibility, and is your net worth less your risks? How much room do you have to maneuver? And how they're likely to change over time, and compared these to other housing finance agencies with similar sized balance sheets. So when we step back from this, we see a set of significant financial strengths. Why don't I start there? You have a net worth of approximately $1 billion. You have AAA ratings by both Moody's and Standard & Poor's. We'll come back to the question of the rating levels. You have positive net cash income in most years, typically in the range of $15 to $20 million in recent years. You have relatively modest real estate risk exposure, and this has been reduced in part because starting in 2012, most single-family lending you do is in mortgage-backed securities backed by the federal government, and so that's reduced some of your exposure. You have what I'll describe as adequate risk-adjusted capital. I'll sort of walk through that, which means the net worth, assets minus liabilities, minus the haircuts, the rating agency risks that are assessed, ranging, so the net of that is something like $400 million for Moody's, $397 million actually, and $460 million for Standard & Poor's. And that's reasonable, not enormous, given your overall liabilities, given the amount of debt you have. Here it turns out,
Sorry to interrupt, Jean. Would you please show this in slideshow mode? It's a little hard to read. So if you just go up to slideshow, I think you could say from current slide, play from current slide. Second to the left there. There we go. You got it.
Okay, sorry, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
I'm glad it's bigger. Okay. Another key thing, and this really stands out to us, is that one of the great strengths of the agency is you have a large non-bond related portfolio, which we've called the ITA, the investment trust account, which actually includes the ITA itself and ECD loans and prime loans. But you have a large amount of this, hundreds of millions of dollars, that provides, there are no bonds against it, and it provides about $15 million of net income each year. This is a key resource of the agency. Not many agencies have this significant kind of extra asset that brings in revenue that helps cover your budget and everything else. And finally, I'd say that unlike many housing finance agencies, which decided to go fully into, we're going to sell our production in the TBA markets, our new single family loans, you've been doing things, issuing bonds, putting them on balance sheet, which has allowed you to expand your balance sheet over the last 5 years. And that provides a stream of ongoing future annual income. So those are all relative strengths of the agency. At the same time, and this is maybe this section I'm now going to describe is by far the most important of the report. So you have a capital structure, a way of operating, which makes it difficult for both the board and the staff to understand and proactively invest your resources. And this is largely due to the nature of the bond resolution, this general resolution under which almost all the resources of the agency exist. As I said, you don't have a separate general fund with its own resources, its own budget, its own credit rating. You just have this one large resolution, some small other separate resolution. And this resolution has a backstop pledge from the state, started in 1972, that would say if you ever run short of the ability, you have to use some of your debt service reserve, the state will replenish it. Now, given the strength of the resolution, that's not likely to be financially necessary or ever expected to be drawn on. Indeed, if anything, the agency is now much more highly rated than the state. So, but that's the way the structure was set up in 1972. And one of the consequences, it says that you can't withdraw money from this to do other things except each December after you've made certain that you didn't need the state's money. So that's just sort of one legal structure. We'll talk about in the long run to change that. Yes.
Gene, just a quick question. Does that effectively put a floor? How will the rating agencies and or the market look at the debt service replenishment? Does it effectively put a floor on the rating? I understand our rating is higher because of our net income, but is it arguable that that becomes the floor or not?
I think it does. I think that replenishment, because the state is rated lower than the agency, state's rated A, you're rated AAA, it makes no difference. It's sort of, at this point, it's just extra. And in fact, maybe I'll throw away one idea here that's going to be one of the recommendations, which is, and we've talked with Hazim and Nandini about creating what's called a rolling amendment to the bond resolution, which means you draft a new amendment and you say for new bonds, starting now, they no longer, it says once 50% of the bonds have been issued from here on. So you automatically have consent of more than 50% of the bondholders. You no longer need the state pledge, and you can create more flexibility. The answer is it may take 5 or 7 years to achieve that. But that notion of a rolling amendment is probably a good idea as a way to let go of some of the things that really aren't essential anymore, but they're still legally there.
I would think the state would find that also particularly attractive because it eliminates a contingent liability for the state.
Yeah, I think it's a good idea for everybody. But at the moment, until such an amendment should go into effect, and that'll take quite a few years because old bonds pay down, you issue new ones. It means $1.5 billion of bonds a long time from now. So, but what we try to do, yes.
Just want to add to Jerry's question. Yes, it will essentially creates a flaw. If in an event that CHFA's rating of bonds is downgraded, it will not be lower than the state's rate.
That's true. Most states do not have such a pledge and are just operate on their own. Okay. But beyond the legal limitations that I've just described, what we found is that there's a series of practices going back 20 plus years, decades ago, that are simply the way cash flows are done and how things are organized that makes it difficult, that's made it difficult to clearly see the choices that you have, to see what monies can be proactively invested in new programs, and to see the financial impacts of particular decisions you're making now. And in effect, what's happened, and I'll show you in a diagram in a minute, what's happened is therefore, in effect, the net income of the agency, unless you made some special decision otherwise, winds up being used to pay down old bonds early. That builds up your future net worth, but it makes it hard to make any other choices today. So these are a set of practices, simply the way cash flows have been done, and part of what we're recommending is to do things differently within these legal limits. So let me describe, this is the existing capital structure. It's maybe a little technical, but I'll try and focus on the main points here. So you have on the left, there are some small resolutions in red that operate, they're simply kept there separately now, and the resources in those, if you make net income, they stay there. Then you have the resolutions, bond assets and liabilities is the bright blue, and principal from those goes into a recoveries of principal account, gets used to redeem bonds. This is all very normal. Everything here within this blue box and how it's used is very normal. What's unusual is that over in this light blue box, which says ITA, this is that other account with all the things not related to the bonds, and the principal and interest on that gets used, the principal gets used to pay down bonds, okay? And the interest gets used together with the interest you earn on the bond assets to pay bonds, to pay issuing costs of new stuff, to cover the budget deficit in your operating, in your budget. $30 million, roughly a $30 million operating budget. To the extent your fees only contribute, fee income you earn is about 7 or 8 million. So there's always a deficit that has to be covered. But it says whatever's money left after paying that deficit, it too will be used to call down bonds. So everything
and the ITA, I'm sorry,
yeah.
Gene, I'm sorry, and ITA, that's the investment trust sub-account in the surplus fund under the resolution?
It's the investment trust account, and then monies go into a surplus fund at the end of the year before you can decide to take anything out or use it for other purposes. Okay. Hazim, you might want to say it better than I can.
No, I think, Jerry, yes, your technical definition is correct.
Okay. So now let me describe, there are 3 changes that we've proposed. All right, one pretty minor, small potatoes at the moment, maybe a more important in the long run, is that the net earnings in the red box, the net earnings from these other resolutions, at the moment it's about $800,000 a year, that money doesn't stay there but gets used to help pay the operating budget. In effect, it contributes to your net income, as you'll see. That's one small change. The second change is that the principal received when you have ITA loans and they prepay, and you get, millions of dollars of prepayments in a year, that rather than that principal winding up being used to call bonds, it simply sits there in a surplus account. It's required legally. It can't go anywhere else until December 1st. It then, if it's not needed to pay bonds, which all the cash flow projections show it isn't needed, if it's not needed to call bonds, it simply automatically gets redeposited in the investment trust account. So in effect, you keep that money to be used to make new ITA type loans. So that's the second change. The third change is that you take the interest that's being earned on the ITA, and after covering all the deficits and everything else, you're going to be left with with a residual. This residual is by definition equal to the net annual income of the agency. It's real cash income, because we've taken into account the other resolutions, we've taken into account the bonds, we've taken into account the ITA. So there's a net income figure this year, let's say about $17 million. And that money, what we're suggesting is it go into a surplus interest account and then be divided for each December 1st in two buckets, half of which goes back to the ITA to make new loans, and half of which goes to something new that we've called, you can change the name of it, an opportunity fund. And the key notion, if you look at this gray box I've drawn around here, is that everything within this gray box be thought of as the sustainable core of the agency. This is the way Mass Housing works. This is the way Minnesota Housing works. That all of these are the parts that the rating agency looks at, and they're basically pledged to bondholders. Everything within this box. The opportunity fund would be outside that box. That means that the money you put into it, you could use for anything. We have specific suggestions of how you can use it synergistically to support and work together with the sustainable core to expand your resources and leverage them. But that's the fundamental notion. And so we started doing this idea of an opportunity fund in 2013 with Mass Housing. That was asked by their governor explicitly, how much money can you take, in effect, from the agency's basic operations and put into new affordable programs that don't meet rating agency standards. Some of it has gone to workforce housing, some of it has gone to very low income housing, some of it has now gone into down payment assistance lending. It's gone to a series of things which the agency wouldn't normally have been able to do before. And when we looked at the network of Mass Housing and what it needed to meet its future, we came up with this approach, and which is in effect, and I think the board and the governor liked this because this was in effect a win-win. It said for every extra dollar of net operating income of the agency, we're doing two things. We're both strengthening the agency's long-term sustainability, and we're creating an opportunity fund which will allow us to create new programs and expand our programs. And that's sort of the fundamental idea.
Questions, if I may.
Yes.
So essentially, the biggest thing that you're doing here is taking the cash flows, and instead of paying off debt systematically, you're creating pots for new loans, right?
Yes.
And in some cases, you're making that pot of money outside of the indenture.
Yes.
And I've always thought, and I'll just say it for what it is, that CHFA has structured itself in part the way that it has is to prevent sweeps from the agency, from the state during periods of budget stress. So this opportunity fund that can be used for any purpose, I'm just warning you, might be used to sweep to the state. I'm just throwing that out. I've always thought that's why CHFA was structured the way it was to try to retain assets. But
I mean, if you want legally, you can still call it part of the resolution. You can physically place it in the resolution. The aim is that it wouldn't be relied on by the rating agencies for their purposes. But the broader answer, and I'll let Nandini speak and everybody else, the broader answer is this approach, I think, allows you to proactively use your net income to do things. And by proactively committing it to actual specific things, it doesn't just become a deposit of free money. It becomes a budget for particular programs that are critical to the state. And by making it a proactive resource, a tool for meeting critical housing needs is in the long run probably the strongest way to make certain that the monies go for key housing needs. The approach of not being proactive can often lead to, as we found from some of our other clients when they weren't, can lead to precisely what you're describing. So,
Jean, this is Lisa. Can I just ask a follow-up? Because I'm just curious, somebody here probably remembers, Sarah, perhaps you do, that CHFA did get swept at one point not that long ago, and I don't think the structure was different than it is now. So I'm not sure the structure does protect us in any event.
And they never let us forget that.
Right. So I think your interest in that question is important, Sarah. But Steve, it sounds like you remember that. So the structure doesn't protect us anyway.
It's happened more than once, Lisa.
As I recall, there's hardly any unrestricted assets on the balance sheet of CHFA.
So then this would not actually, if that logic plays out, then this logic here would not create a new risk to the entity. Is that right, Steve Kitowitz, from your perspective?
I think that's right, yeah.
This opportunity fund is an unrestricted asset, I think.
But as you said,
Steve, you're muted.
It keeps changing on me. As you said, Sarah, most of the stuff is unrestricted already. That's how we were able to sweep money in the past.
Yes, Steve, you're not allowed to do that.
You've met our legislature, Commissioner.
I think ultimately the board is going to have to get comfortable that the approach laid out by Jean of being proactive and making this money available for programs that may be designated at each December. I mean, I guess that could be an approach we take. Outweighs the risk of going out there with money that's outside the sustainable core. I mean, that's a judgment call we're going to have to make based on our need for that we have to meet in the state for affordable housing.
It does.
I have is would using the cash flows instead of redeeming debt to make new loans that are not, have higher credit quality, would that ultimately long-term impact the credit rating of the trust?
Yeah, I think not, because what you're doing here is you're taking the extra income and you're doing two things. So it's the money, in effect, rather than reducing your net worth, when you're putting half of the residual income back into high creditworthy assets in the ITA, you're strengthening the net worth of the agency, therefore you're supporting the rating. And so the only money that's not being used for that purpose is a portion of the extra income. And we've discussed this with the rating agencies, both for CHFA, but also more generally with the states. They see this as a way of strengthening an agency.
But what about the argument that the money will not be available in case of an emergency because you haven't committed to an asset?
That's true. This is basically
that will impact. That should make the rating agencies less comfortable.
No, because what you're doing
in the case of an emergency, you don't have funding available, right? Because it's not that easily convertible to cash.
Well, let me start.
But that's true today too, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right, but this will only make it more difficult.
Well, today, if we don't have the extra cash, we're not using it to call bonds. So they're not relying on the net worth growing out of bounds for the rating. It's just that the practice has been to retire bonds early, but the rating agencies aren't relying on that additional net worth.
No, but that's not bad. That's positive. That's positive because you're reducing your debt.
Well, in the long run, yes, it will create net worth years from now, or it'll create available net worth years from now when the debt goes away. But I think the rating agencies are looking at your ability and the cash flows and the projections, and we've tested all these things. I'll show you in the appendix. We've tested all these things against what happens under all these rating agency scenarios. So I think the answer.
But rating agencies are important, but as we found out in 2008, 2010, and more recently, rating agencies like hiring the
Fine.
The best gunfighter, right? They're for sale.
Yes, and unbelievably so.
And trust me, we sued them and we won a lot of money in the state, right? And the permanent banker was part of that.
What I'm
It was
saying
actually the AG's office who did it, but we assisted on it.
What I'm saying is, did you have the resources, and given your net worth, the adequacy of resources currently to sustain the ratings? The rating agencies aren't. I'll move away from the rating agencies. We're going to come back and talk about actual risks and what are risks that you deal with that hopefully can address some of it later on in the discussion. Why don't I come back to that issue? So 2 issues have been raised, or several issues. One was risk. We have another recession is taking these extra resources. In this case, it would be something like, if you made $17 million this year, we'd be taking $8.5 million and putting it in an opportunity fund. And first of all, one of the things I want to emphasize is when we describe the uses of the opportunity fund, these are approaches. They're not rating agency measured, and they're not, but they're approaches that will in fact strengthen the agency. For example, one of the approaches we've outlined here is allowing you to take on initiatives where the opportunity fund will provide in effect the first loss guarantee for activities that CHAFA can undertake, home improvement lending, additional down payment assistance lending. So think of the opportunity fund not as sort of lost money, but rather as a tool that can strengthen, guarantee, and protect CHAFA in taking on programmatic efforts that use a combination of money from the sustainable core and money from the opportunity fund. Think of it as a synergistic resource. So I think they're all the right questions. And why don't we, at the moment, put them on hold, or identify any others, and see whether the approaches we've laid out in the rest of the study adequately address those concerns. That would be my suggestion that we'll go through in the next half hour or so.
I guess my only question is the 50%. Is that like, so taking a step back. So this is outside the resolution, right? So you're talking about essentially implementing a policy change at CHIFA, right? That's all this really is basically us adopting a policy and some internal guidelines, because we're obviously not monkeying around with the resolution at all. And so my question is, one, confirm that that's in fact, I understand that correctly. And then 2, if that's in fact what we're talking about, is the 50%, is that, I assume that's just kind of like, so the balance between, to George's comment, we still, want to, use some of our surplus cash flow to continue our practice of paying down debt. And this is just kind of a more tentative. Is that something that you anticipate being baked into the program, something that would be subject to discretion by the board or by staff? If you could just, and was there any science to the 50-50, other, not to make any criticism, or is it just like, well, it's new, it's changed, so let's be, somewhat, moderate in implementation?
No, to the last question, we evaluated it in part. We had to make this, as I said, this decision or recommendation back from Mass Housing in 2013. And there were other alternatives. Minnesota, who we've worked with and done studies for since 2007, puts 100% of their net income into their equivalent of an opportunity fund. But their net worth in relationship to their liabilities is significantly greater. they have maybe about the same amount of liabilities you have, but their net worth, the cash, the risk-adjusted net worth is significant, not quite double, but it's like 2/3 higher. So when we look, when I get to the risk adjustments, I'll describe what that basis was. The notion was given the nature of the risks you have, the rating agencies' evaluations of those, and where you have in terms of your financial flexibility, we thought 50-50 is about the right mix, and creates a win-win. It says for every extra dollar we make, that's a good thing because it lets us both do new programs as well as strengthen our sustainability. So it puts everybody on the same side of the table. So I think it's one is that reason, but the second is from actually looking at you compared to other agencies and where you stand in terms of net assets to debt and so forth.
Okay, Jean, I think
should I go on?
Continue.
Okay, all right. These are all the questions I expected, and they're all excellent questions, and the issues you should be raising. Okay, so here I'm just repeating in words the same things we've talked about, that the principal received in IT loans would be redeposited to the ITA. Last year, that would have provided approximately $10 million back for making new lending. And the key notion here is that the ITA loans would be ones that they meet your mission, but they're interest-bearing, they're amortizing, they're reasonable investments that receive significant rating agency credit. So examples, new permanent loans on 9% projects. We're going to talk about CHAFA potentially funding its own down payment assistance loans to complement and supplement those from the state DAP fund. A possible new program of home improvement loans for low and moderate income homeowners, which has been very successful in Minnesota and given one of your strategic priorities. And the key is to maintain the overall credit quality of the ITA. These monies, until December 1st, they have to be held in the ITA, but that you can still anticipate, plan for what they're going to be used, use them for investments in the meantime. And so the lending plan for the year that gets presented by Helene to you would say, and here's our recommendations for next year for new ITA lending. The second thing I described was moving the income from the resolutions over to cover to help cover the operating deficit. And the third is just what I described in terms of using the residual and allocating that so if you did this year, it would provide roughly $8 or $8.5 million each for more ITA lending and for opportunity fund lending. And we have specific proposals that we've talked through about how you might do this to strengthen the agency. So you shouldn't think of this as sort of independent from how you would actually use the money, but concretely. Sayla certainly made this point to me, that we think of this as a specific tool. So the advantages of this structure, it's fully consistent with your existing documents, it's consistent with your ratings. It makes it easier to separate your available resources from what are very complex bond cash flows, and makes it easier for you to make choices and to see what range of choices you have. It defines in many ways the dollar amount of choices that you have and what you can do with that, and allows you to proactively address housing challenges in the state at a time when the state's own resources for housing are likely to be under pressure while maintaining your long-term sustainability. So that's sort of the key fundamental idea, that we're then going to talk about this in light of rating agencies, risks, net income, strategies, what you can do, but that's sort of the central idea. So why don't any other questions on this basic issue yet? I realize we're going to come back to it.
I have one question. So all of what you're proposing here can be done within the current indenture.
Yes.
Earlier on, you referred to some rolling amendment, I guess, to roll off the need for the state guarantee. But
Yes.
is that related to this?
No.
Okay.
And is that something 5 year, hopefully, if you should implement, you should begin that now, because 5 years from now or 7 years from now, it'll give you even more flexibility. And you won't have to be bound by the state guarantee. But this is all a recommendation. Before we even talked about a rolling amendment, this is the key recommendation we came to. This is the key idea.
And just one question on the state guarantee, because just, you know, I'm involved in that. Every bond issue, I have to get the treasurer sign off and so forth. And we have about 4.4 billion last I looked. But, and it's ridiculous, I guess, for the state to be guaranteeing AAA rated bonds. But I did hear during the financial crisis of 07, 08, that actually that was helpful to CHFA during that housing crisis. But maybe Hazeem could speak to that. Maybe because so many of your loans are federally insured, it really wasn't that necessary. Was it helpful during the crisis, state guarantee, or is it really unnecessary, I guess?
I think from the rating agency standpoint, it was probably helpful because it was something that they knew CHFA had a backstop. Because you have to keep in mind, back in 2008, 2009, during the financial crisis, it was something that, just like what's happening this year, totally unexpected from a financial meltdown standpoint. And when S&P was downgrading the sovereign rating, they were looking at HFAs where, you know, we as an industry were heavily concentrated with government backed. So S&P started questioning whether or not HFAs could retain the AAA. But because CHFA has this, you know, like it has a very vast portfolio between multifamily, single family, whole loan, PMI, plus the state general pledge, that's one of the reasons why we were somewhat spared from the overall review and downgrade.
Well, my question, which may not be realistic, is can we have our cake and eat it? Meaning, don't use the guarantee unless we have to.
Well, that's where you are now. I mean, you don't have to do this rolling amendment.
Right, I mean,
and you don't have to.
If you have that option now, you have to do it without the guarantee, and if we go back to the 2008, 2010, whatever crisis, it's always an option. I don't know. I mean, I would hate to give up that option if we ever need it, but don't use it, you know? But we're not making any decisions. So.
What do you think, Jim?
Let's go through the discussion of the risks, because I think it'll be important. I don't feel strongly about this. I think it'll give you more flexibility. Everything we've done in the study sort of assumed that you still had the guarantee, because we had to operate within it.
Okay.
So I think all the recommendations are the same regardless. This is one way of, you know, potentially reducing that, but I don't think it's crucial to any of the other decisions. Sort of, I think you can view it on. In fact, we have recommendations of a resolution, of creating a new resolution that wouldn't use it at all, and that's something you can legally do now. So I think you have lots of tools whether or not you want to change that. Okay. So now let me turn to ratings, balance sheet, and risk. So I know there have been questions about the AAA rating. So first of all, this is not something that under the indenture you can simply decide to do something that's going to put, you know, that's going to reduce that rating. You can't legally pull out cash that would reduce that rating. You can't issue bonds that would violate that. I mean, the rating agencies may ultimately, you know, they can adjust their criteria, they can evaluate you, they can make that decision, but this isn't something that you have a choice of to decide to, oh, we're just going to violate this. So having said that, I think it's useful to understand a couple of things. First, that this clarified capital structure can let you, with a AAA rating, do a lot more to expand your program and financing choices. That the rating is valuable in that it enables you to finance programs at very low cost. Your bonds are some of the lowest, you know, cost bonds that are issued in the country for housing. And so you can view it as a tool that helps you achieve your objectives while creating other financing mechanisms as needed. There's not viewing this as something, this is going to drive all our decisions, but rather this is simply where we are. This is what we have in the general resolution. What else can we do? We've talked a lot about, already more than enough maybe, about the state rating. Important to recognize this AAA rating is not proof, as I think it was Jerry said, is certainly not proof that the rating agencies won't change their minds or things will be different in the future. And they're only looking at current production. So that's why we've then tested, the cash flow consultant filled in 3 years of additional production and then applied the rating agency stress cases to see, is what we're doing now sustainable itself? And the results are still generally quite strong across all the runs. Okay. Let me turn to the balance sheet. This just gives you a picture. The top line here is the total assets of the agency, which you can see has grown from less than 5 billion to 5.7 billion or so. The deep blue is the bond debt. And so the difference between those is the net assets of the agency, which have remained relatively stable over the last few years. So this is a good picture in terms of maintaining a set of resources that will provide ongoing income to the agency. Let me just talk about net worth for a moment. So this total net worth, approximately 960 billion, is important to financial sustainability in at least 3 ways. One, it provides an ongoing stream of net interest earnings that helps you cover your operating deficit and helps provide additional income. It provides the resources to maintain the agency and its operations if future production were significantly curtailed. And this is no academic matter. I mean, go back, wind the clock back less than 3 years, the House of Representatives voted to eliminate the tax exemption on housing bonds, on all private activity bonds. And we were nervously waiting where the Senate came out. Or if FHA changes their rules on down payment assistance with their lending. Lots of things can happen that can change your ability to continue to earn money in the future. So having this balance, having this net worth is valuable from that point of view, and it allows you to cover potentially adverse events. The loan losses that you suffered on single-family whole loans during the Great Recession, the loss you suffered on Temple Street in 2018, losses as a result of COVID, impacts of changes in interest rates. So, but more important than just the risk, the net worth itself, is the risk-adjusted net worth after taking into account the risks. So let's look at those. So here, just look, I think the main point is just to look, the red are the haircuts or reductions, the risk assignments, in effect, that Standard & Poor's makes and that Moody's makes. So the deep blue becomes, from their point of view, your risk-adjusted net worth. And then they compare that to your liabilities, using a standard of about 110% of having risk-adjusted net worth to liabilities. You're slightly below that for Moody's. We had discussions with them. They don't view that as a major issue. They recognize all these other factors, strength, their haircuts is somewhat arbitrary. But what this says is it's important for you to maintain this risk-adjusted net worth and grow it at least some, rather than say, oh, it's more than enough. And as you reduce risks, as loans pay off, old loans that have risks, they pay off, or you increase your net worth, you can take on more risks. So maintaining and growing this risk-adjusted net worth is an important thing to do. That's the main message from this. Some tools for maintaining this risk-adjusted net worth. One is, this is bizarre, but Standard & Poor's, for their own peculiar reasons, because you have billions of dollars of mortgage-backed securities, government-backed, in your resolution. And because you also have whole loans in that resolution, Standard & Poor's does a haircut on these mortgage-backed securities. If you did new lending in a new resolution, it'll be rated AAA itself. And this is what many other states have gone to after the Great Recession. You wouldn't have those haircuts, and there are actually a whole bunch of other benefits. You wouldn't need 2 months of debt service reserve. So we're recommending you create a new resolution to do much of new single family loan, just to avoid the sort of ridiculousness of this provision. A second thing that's not only rating agency but material is one of the things you can do, and many other agencies who do a lot of multifamily lending have done, is they use FHA risk share, which is co-insurance, that covers half the loss on new multifamily loans, and the cost of it is incredibly inexpensive, 1/8 of 1%. Your own underwriting standards already conform to those, and in fact, using this may allow you to streamline and standardize your approaches. We recommend simplify even further for smaller loans. So from talking with Masuda, we talked about the notion that you might apply this risk share requirement for permanent loans that are more than $3 million. So it'll be some standard. That'll reduce the amount of exposure. You have both real exposure and rating agency. And finally, the other approach we're suggesting is something we did with Colorado a couple of years ago, is the notion of actually having a risk budget. Hazim presents to you a regular budget, says we're going to spend money on these things. But you can think of risk as something you're allocating as well. So let me just show you what one of these might look like. This is just illustrative. This is mocked up from Colorado, so it's not particular to Connecticut. But it basically says, okay, for a given year in some state, there's an increase in the net worth of the agency. Just like we said, this might be $8 million this year, you put it back into it. There's a decrease in real estate risk because loans have paid down that had risks associated with it. So you have 19 million more risk capacity. This is within the sustainable core. And at the same time, okay, here's our new lending plan. We expect to do this much of risk share lending, which has these kinds of haircuts, other multifamily lending, second mortgages, whatever it is. These together total that up. So it's a way of saying, as we're making new lending decisions, taking into account the level of risk of the decisions you're making. We think this is I don't think you need to do this year, but this is a general recommendation we think would be a useful device in just making your overall decisions, given your framework.
Hey, Jean.
Yes.
Given that we've got about 20 minutes or so left,
yes.
Should we pivot to the recommendation section, or how would you like to?
Sure. Let me just run through a couple of things very quickly in 3 minutes, and then we'll get to the recommendations. Okay. So the thing I just want to point out here is that single-family mortgage-backed securities have grown from like 587 million 4 years ago to 2 billion at the end of 2019. It'll be even more at the end of this year. So a lot of your actual risks have been reduced by doing that. That's been a big shift. Okay. Let me focus then on net annual income, because that's really the driver of what choices you're going to have, whether it goes to the Opportunity Fund or it goes back into net worth and the ITA. Net income is a critical thing. This looks at the years, each of the years, and you can see a couple of things. You've generally made $16 to $20 million, except in 2018 when you had the loss on Temple Street. That's one thing. Second, that there are likely to be some pressures pushing this down in the next couple of years, including some Section 8 administrative contracts that HUD is shifting over to other vendors. And likely there will be COVID or foreclosure expenses and losses that got postponed this year because the courts closed because of COVID. They'll be pushed back a year or two. So there'll be some pressure, or pension obligations, there'll be some pressures on income. And the third thing that stands out is you can see this line for ITA, this year something like 15.9 million, that's net income coming in without any interest cost to it. That's a key resource of the agency. That's really helps maintain the net. That's roughly equal to your net income. So that's very important. This shows that history and then shows projections under these scenarios with higher rates in red, low rates probably the most likely outcome, and a stress case down below. And the other thing we've done is we've divided income into 3 categories. We spent a lot of time, and there's stuff in the appendix that deals with this. It's a very important way of looking at HFAs and comparing them to each other. You have ongoing income from past activities, the things you happen to you just from opening you don't have to do anything. These are your old loans. The net income that you make off them, your net interest earnings, loan losses on them, that's the ongoing income, roughly $45 million a year. There's the money you invest in future income, roughly $10 million in cost of issuance and lender origination fees. So it's very important to earn enough income on those. And then there's the current year income. This is your budget for $30 million less your fee income. So when you add these all together, that's your combined net income. But by separating these out, it allows you to see what are different ways that you can deal with each of those. And I've tried, this shows projections of how much, assuming these different scenarios, would be available to be deposited to the Opportunity Fund and to ITA. So it would show in the low rate case, the likeliest that might be 8.7 million of each this year, likely to be somewhat depressed next year because of deferred foreclosure expenses and so forth. And this shows on a cumulative basis how much this might be over the next 3 years, 4 years. And I've tried to show that as a chart, just showing the blue would be additional deposits to the ITA, and the green would be cumulative deposits to the Opportunity Fund. These would be the resources that you would have available. Okay, there's a whole series of detailed ways of building income, but they're going to come back again in the recommendations we'll make. So why don't I talk about them there? Okay, so putting the framework to use. So what I wanted then to do, and we'll spend maybe 5 minutes on each of these, and then 5 minutes on an overall wrap up, and then dive into questions. So homeownership. We'll try to look at both homeownership and at multifamily. So homeownership, you have various strengths. You have a strong mortgage-backed securities program that eliminates financial risk. It can be used for selling those loans and for interest-only transactions. I think Hazim mentioned those. We've sort of pioneered those over the last 4 months with a series of agencies that are making lots of money for agencies, lots of future income for agencies. You've had, unusually, this revolving down payment assistance fund financed by the state, a strong lending pipeline, modest prepayment speed, so you keep earning spread income longer. A third-party servicer, Idaho, at a low fixed cost, and an effective way of issuing bonds. On the other hand, you have challenges. You have a very limited amount of private activity bond allocation, with multifamily as the priority for that. The down payment assistance program got cut dramatically. How much assistance you provide each borrower in 2018 is part of discussions with the state to make certain you didn't run out of money as housing costs went up in particular parts of the state. So, but that has impacts itself on what you offer people. Your total lender compensation is relatively low. And you've been competing not on down payment assistance, but on having the lowest rate possible, sometime in the spring, probably the lowest rate of any HFA we know of in the country, which has depressed the spread that you're earning, which makes it difficult for you to achieve an adequate return on your costs. And to the extent you need taxable debt to stretch that, that makes that problem even worse. So those are fundamental challenges. So the reduction in down payment assistance, spread income, and limited amounts of private activity bond allocation. So what we've suggested, maybe this will seem counterintuitive, is the most important thing to do is to move toward a world in which you're competing on down payment assistance. That you're in a state, in particular, given the way real estate taxes have to be prepaid at closing, when people have very large costs, that creates a significant impediment to first-time home buyers. And so what we're suggesting is that you expand your down payment assistance back to the combined 105% loan to value with no asset test. You do one thing many of our clients have done, which is that we're going to be generous here, but we are going to require a minimum cash contribution of $1,000, just so somebody has some skin in the game. And you would increase the maximum amount of this to $20,000 for any borrower. Now, how can you do this? How can we expand down payment assistance? One reason is that the state DAP fund has been replenished with prepayments that have come in as rates have dropped in the last few years. You currently have about $33 million, which could fund these higher amounts, including new prepayments, for the next 3 years anyway. So you have a lot of money available that you can do this now. You were very, conservative 2 years ago. This has put you together with lots of prepayments you couldn't have counted on in a much better position. But even more important, and this is a key recommendation, you can fund if you ever were to run out of this money, this is an ideal lending activity for the ITA. Minnesota has done this with their monthly payment loans. These are amortizing loans. And we're suggesting that in making these loans, the 10 cents on the dollar come from the Opportunity Fund to help cover the losses, which has been roughly the loss levels on these. So given you have significant ITA resources, you don't have to worry about running out of down payment assistance. We also think this is very important that you not allow borrowers to resubordinate. When the borrower prepays, he gets a new loan from you or somebody or from you, and you're saying, okay, you don't have to pay us back that. That's wonderful for that borrower. But the impact is it impacts your ability to help other borrowers. It means you get more prepayments a lot sooner, you earn less spread, and you have less cash from it. So it really comes at the expense of helping new first-time home buyers. This is a whole discussion, but we went through this in Colorado. We think this is a very important part of this. So, but taken together, these allow you to do significantly more down payment assistance lending. Most state HFAs, 90 to 95% of their lending has down payment assistance. At this point, you're like 40 or 45%, and that makes you forced to compete more and more on having the lowest rate possible, when the bigger problem that's an obstacle, particularly today's historically low rates, is having the cash to buy a home and to compete against other people who are buying. So that's our most important recommendation on homeownership. That you set, let me just highlight these others briefly, that you set loan rates with issuing bonds to provide the equivalent of the IRS spread of 1 1/8, or at least 1%, without taking on future unhedged rate risk, which you've been doing to keep rates low. That you take advantage of this mortgage-backed securities platform so you can sell loans on a TBA basis. The premiums for those are very high at the moment. That provides extra cash income for the agency. You can do interest-only strips, which keeps, you basically sell the loan, you retain an interest-only strip. I have a chart in the appendix that shows at the moment you can earn about 60 basis points, actually that's conservative. Recently it's been 70 basis points more income from doing this than from selling bonds. This may not last. This is partly a function of Federal Reserve policy and what they're buying. But as long as you can do this, this doesn't use any private activity bond allocation and significantly increase your future income. So we think this is a really good thing to be doing soon. And you would continue to issue bonds selectively to take advantage of refunding opportunities and for other reasons. We've said establish a new, more efficient AAA rated homeownership resolution. Only needs one rating for Moody's. Doesn't get into all these other issues. It's financially much more efficient and will save you money. That you begin hedging the pipeline, which you haven't to date, to protect you against interest rate risks. You incentivize lenders to deliver loans faster. And we're suggesting that you consider a home improvement loan program with a 10% loss guarantee from the Opportunity Fund. That's home ownership in 6 minutes. Let me try multifamily. Okay. We've had a strong track record, a large portfolio, priority of using PAB for this. You've established new, clear, attractive loan rates. You've had a partnership with DOH for providing gap funds. You applied for this Treasury Capital Magnet Fund. But there are challenges. Borrowers haven't been able to prepay. That's led to, conflicts, and more important, it's part of a pattern of the agency not being seen as a user-friendly multifamily lender. Partly that's a matter of procedures and requirements, and it can't prepay and so forth. The other major reality is that most of the projects you've been involved with, both 4% and 9%, require deep subsidies. But DOH has increasingly limited available funds to do that with. And it also means the deep subsidy versions, you've done relatively little lending coming out of the strategic plan in suburban communities, which may be crucial to housing choice. And you have a QAP that sets standards beyond the federal standards, deeper than the federal standards for affordability for 4% projects. So projects that might not need deep subsidies can't qualify. And at the same time, you have increasing expectations to do more. So we look at that pattern and say, what can we do different? So on the first issue, we've suggested, this is an approach similar to mass housing went to, of allowing prepayments after 15 years, 1 point premium, of refinancing with you, 20 years without. Most borrowers, in fact, are likely to keep many of their loans outstanding anyway. We've tested the cash flows against that. Yeah, there's some cost, but it's one that you can easily absorb. And most important, I know the questions come up of, well, we have regulatory requirements and affordability we care about. You still would have those protections built into the compliance agreements and your regulatory agreement. You don't have to keep a small loan outstanding in order to enforce those. This will allow you, I think, to achieve your same affordability goals, but in a way that's more user-friendly and encourages people to work with you. That we suggest amending the QAP to allow 4% tax credit loans without deeper affordability. You already have a 40-year requirement. You set loan rates to provide a spread of at least 1%. And you view the ITA as a powerful resource for new first mortgages, as takeouts for 4% tax credit projects and loans on 9%. We've worked with Masuda when she was in Colorado on precisely, many of these initiatives. And we talked about using FHA risk share. So here are 3 ways, and I'll get concrete right before we turn to specific use of the fund. Here are 3 ways the Opportunity Fund can be used to make multifamily lending, your own multifamily lending, more attractive and effective. One is you can buy down the interest rate on selected bond and ITA loans. If you were going to make a loan at 3.5%, but you want to be able to lend that money at 3%, you can use 5 cents on the dollar from the Opportunity Fund to buy the rate down by 50 basis points. And that's also the first loss. This is something we pioneered in Colorado, we've done in Minnesota, and I think Masuda can testify. It's been very effective at allowing an agency to expand its multifamily lending. You can also, one of the great things about the ITA is you're going to have cash there in future years. So you can make commitments 2 years in advance for a permanent takeout of a 4% loan or a 9% loan. And obviously, you don't know what interest rates will be, so you're making a judgment. I would say you set a judgment higher than today's rate for locking in the rate 2 years from now. But if rates go even higher, we set aside a little bit of opportunity fund money and 5 cents on the dollar to help protect the yield to the ITA. And finally, you can make some small, modest gap loans where that becomes the critical thing to your being able to assist the project. Not the project that needs $10 million. You don't have those kinds of resources. That's the DOH money. But it needs $250,000 or $500,000 to cover costs of issuance or to cover a small gap on a loan. This is an ideal use of the opportunity fund. Why don't I move ahead then to how do these relate to your strategic priorities? So here were 5 priorities that were listed that were coming out of the strategic plan initially. And we tried to show partnering with others, like allowing prepayments, exploring opportunities for pairing multifamily loans with project rate vouchers to local housing authorities, matching this helping to house New England grant with $1 million from the ITA lender, partnering with FHA risk share. These are different tools. Once you've created this idea of a sustainable core and an opportunity fund, you can actually see the agency far more dynamically in using these resources together to help borrowers. We've talked about the QAP, this notion of moderate income homeowners build wealth through homeownership. That's the key recommendation of significantly expanding down payment assistance. Developing and implementing a home improvement program, we've laid out here. Taking risk into account, that's precisely what we've tried to do with this. So now let me get to sort of our specific recommendations for not the opportunity fund, it's just money over there, but what would we actually do? So first, it's important to see the different pieces of the agency as separate pieces that can be used together, how they can fit together, how they can plug in. So we're talking about the opportunity fund here and the ITA here, and asking how can they be used together. So let me turn to the next page and say, here's a proposed budget coming from discussions with Hazim and Nandini and Samdasela of what you might do. So assume we have $8 million for the opportunity fund for this year. You've already applied for a capital magnet fund to Treasury, which requires you to match. If they give you $4 million, you have to use $4 million of your own for deep subsidies. This is an ideal use of the opportunity fund. And if you get this money from Treasury, you've leveraged it 2 to 1. You get $8 million of money. But even if you don't win the competition, you still are able to run this program. You don't have to rely on Treasury doing this. So that's sort of recommendation 1, because you've already made that commitment. Second, you can create a homeownership lending guarantee fund. This is what I was talking about. That would allow you, if you're making second mortgages from the sustainable core, and here we're talking about a home improvement lending program, to provide 10 cents on the dollar as the first loss position. So that leverages that $1 million with $10 million of total lending. And the remaining, in the long run, if we ever ran a down payment assistance, that same guarantee fund could be used for the down payment assistance fund. But the third use, the remaining money, the $3 million that would be left, the $3.5 million, would be used for enhancing multifamily lending through interest rate buydowns, interest rate protection with small gap loans, typically at a ratio of about 20 to 1. So in effect, this would allow you to take $8 million of opportunity fund money to enhance, strengthen, guarantee, protect somewhere between $74 and $78 million of new lending. So that's what I mean when I say, think of the opportunity fund as commitments to specific, proactive, highly leveraged things that expand your capacity, expand what you can do as an agency. I'm going to turn for a moment. There are a couple of others that are related to this. So now we look back at the blue ink, the sustainable core, and say, well, what does that mean in terms of things we would do with the ITA? Well, if we're using $1 million from the ITA to subsidize to guarantee home improvement lending, we need ITA money to make the loans, the rest of the loans. You're getting $1 million grant from Federal Home Loan Bank of Boston for helping to house New England. What we've discussed with Nandini is using that for a mobile home refinancing program. So you could use the Helping to House New England will buy the rate down to 1% on those loans on $5 million, from the ITA, total of about $6 million you could make available. And then if that becomes a powerful use, you can look a year from now and say, hey, we can use $1 million of opportunity fund money coming a year from now to continue that program. And you would use ITA for making multifamily loans in conjunction with single family. So I think those are the major recommendations. Let me leave with one last thing before I run out of time. Then I've opened it up to every question you guys can have. One of the things we found powerful is the idea of a checklist that agencies, Mass Housing, Minnesota, Colorado can use in making decisions. As I said at the beginning, you have very complicated decisions with different moving parts. Here's how to use PAB here. Here's what do we do about home improvement lending here? What do we do about borrower prepayments there? All these different choices. That what I've tried to do is create a checklist specific to Chaffa. And what this checklist means, if the action or decision helps in at least one of these ways and doesn't hurt any of them, that's a positive thing in terms of your long-term sustainability. And so these become specific questions that if a program is being recommended to you, a bond issue is being recommended to you, the question can be, and the staff can be expected to provide, in effect, this checklist and say, yes, what we did on, for example, the whole capital structure was designed to deal with number one, right? Without making the others worse. That was the whole purpose of it. How can we reduce our sensitivity to future interest rates? You'll see in the detailed recommendations, I haven't spent the time on the call, that you have a lot of unhedged variable rate debt. Some of that is naturally hedged because you have cash, but a fair amount isn't. Rates have gotten to historically low levels. You've made a lot of money doing this. Now we think is the time to take some of the chips off the table and lock in interest rate swaps at historically low levels, like 1.3%. Levels, they've never been this low, to protect against rates going up. You have fixed rate assets. You don't want to have variable rate unhedged debt for a lot of those assets. So that would be a recommendation that would say, yes, reduce the sensitivity to future interest rates, limits unhedged bonds to the amount of Chaffa's cash investment. Does it maintain or increase our future risk-adjusted net worth? Does it help increase and stabilize our long-term annual income? Does it use that money for these two purposes? Does it increase our return in future income? When we invest in cost of issuance, are we meeting the minimum spread threshold? Are we using our PAB collectively all the ways to maximize the return to Chaffa? So if things are doing these and don't violate them, then part of the purpose of the study is to provide sort of an ongoing checklist that you can use for making decisions. So why don't I stop there? I know I've run through the last half of this at somewhat breakneck speed and let you guys unfold and raise critical questions.
So, Jen and Tim, first of all, let me thank you for this presentation. It has been great to see a complicated structure in your 55 slides, but it's a lot easier to understand our risks and opportunities and how can we proactive and continue supporting, especially the homeownership, which creates wealth among the first-time home buyers. So I'm going to open it up, and thank you, of course, Hazin and Nandini, for all the amount of work that you guys put into this to help us understand the finance plan that we have for this coming year. Questions for Jean? I don't know if everybody left. Well, you were very clear and concise, and everybody understood what you said. That's awesome. Thank you.
Question, it seems like your home ownership strategy is to charge higher rates, because CHFA is like the lowest single family rate. But then to really go in deep on the down payment assistance to make it competitive. That seems like a main strategy. But the higher rates, will that make it harder for people to qualify for certain prices of homes, and even with the down payment assistance? So something to think about.
Modestly, but remember, rates are at historically low levels. And I'm not suggesting that you actually have to increase rates currently. In effect, what happened is you set the rates quite low in the spring, the 2 7/8, much below maybe any other, or below any other agency. We've seen since then the cost of funds has dropped. So I think you can meet, and using these new financing techniques, this interest-only strips and so forth, I think you can meet these targets at your current rates. I don't think you have to do anything differently at the moment. And use all these tools. It just means that you don't have to drive yourself crazy. You shouldn't be issuing bonds at such low spreads that you're not going to make the money back. You need to find other tools that'll both make the loans attractive to borrowers, or other ways of selling the loans, or using interest-only strips. You need to find other tools that will enable you to do it more sustainably over the long run. That's really the point. Not that you have to do anything fundamentally different. I think the rates now work fine in the current environment.
And I think that this checklist is awesome. It'll give us something to look at in when we make decisions. Any other questions or comments for Jean?
Yes, Sela, it's Jerry. Just I know it's been a long meeting, so I don't want to use any more people's time. But Jean, and if I'm just had one question out of curiosity. I mean, we as I understand it, keep the mortgage-backed securities on our balance sheet, which is not necessarily a practice that all similar HFAs do. And so presumably we could originate those same mortgages, hold them for some period of time and sell them, or presumably we could sell pieces of them, or sell the credit risk, or sell the bonds and retain the credit risk. And that isn't on your checklist, but wondering if you had looked at that. And again, I don't want to use any more people's time, but I was just curious about that.
Let me just show you this shows the cumulative impact over the last 4 months of production. This blends together what we've done in Colorado and Minnesota, basically, to say if we had issued bonds doing about the level of production you're doing over the last 4 months, it would have generated something like $8 million in net present value in the future. This isn't all cash income. This is just over the future. Selling bonds. If we had done interest-only strips that also provide an ongoing income stream, that amount would have been almost twice as much. That's taking advantage of the current environment. I'm not suggesting you abandon doing bonds. I think there are real reasons why bonds are valuable. In certain cases, you have refunding opportunities. Azim has helped create 30 million of zero participations that can blend and allow you to be less than full spread on SIMB lending. There are some important reasons to do bonds. I'm suggesting not being limited only to those, but to using the full range of tools, including selling some of the mortgage-backed securities. I think having an ongoing income stream, whether interest-only strips or from bonds, is valuable, not abandoning that entirely and just focusing on current income. Some agencies did that. I wouldn't recommend going there, but I think you can have a more balanced approach.
Okay, thank you.
And just one quick question on the under one of your suggestions for use of the Opportunity Fund, you proposed a 0.5% advantage for specific multifamily properties. Just wondering whether you had any thoughts on how to use that, how to target that, or are you assuming that could be used by CHFA to target based on sort of policy or QAP or other sorts of basically to prioritize different types of projects.
Probably the key would be to use it for those that otherwise aren't going to be able to be done without needing deep subsidies. And there's ones where that modest difference can make a difference in your particular situation. I think where Masuda used it in Colorado, where we designed this, was in order, the aim was the agency wasn't doing any of the lending on 9% tax credit projects. And using this tool and reaching out to the lenders that Masuda did very effectively, Colorado became able to use this as a marketing tool, in effect, to win those competitions. And they wound up doing, 75% of the lending on those projects. So I think it's a tool that can be used to meet your particular needs. We haven't, I think I leave that to staff as to, what are the recommendations for the particular things. But it's a tool, you can't use it on every loan, but it's a tool you can use on those where it'll make a difference that's strategically important to you. You want to encourage in an area where you haven't done lending before, where there's no other low-income housing, maybe that's the place you use it. I think those are precisely the policy decisions you ought to make.
Thank you.
One more question, since it's almost time.
I think it would be nice to have some direction from the board in terms of their receptiveness to the Opportunity Fund, because that would be something that we would want to fold into our draft budget for October.
So I think, go ahead, Lisa.
No, I just wanted to react to that and say that I think this is really exciting and very responsive to a lot of discussion that we've had over many months about wanting to thoughtfully look at what we could do to be more innovative and to stretch the resources available so that we can have a bigger impact with regard to the organization's mission. And so what I see here is some really, I think, very forward-leaning, but yet very thoughtful sets of ideas that I think achieve that. And what I also really like about this is that clearly what you're doing is bringing in knowledge from other leaders in the nation, including Minnesota and Colorado, so that we know that these are potential pathways that have been proven elsewhere as well. So I think that's really exciting, and I would very much, for my part, I'd really like to see us move this direction.
Yeah, I think so too, Lisa. Thank you for that. I know that Nandini and Hazin and the consultants have been doing really good work that it's going to help us in our strategic plan. And I think that Hazin now has a direction with the lending plan that he needs to present to us to work in a very specific way. So I think that this is not just a study done, but it's also concrete recommendations that we can utilize.
This is George. The only thing I would say is, I would like to understand, I know we've been comparing to Colorado, Montana a lot, right? But in many ways, we're much different in Colorado and Montana.
Minnesota.
So I really would like to understand those differences a little better, not necessarily right now because we don't have the time. Because, I mean, for instance, Denver alone is growing more than the entire state of Connecticut's growing, right? And the need of housing and population. Montana, when I talk to my counterparts.
Minnesota, you mean, George?
Minnesota. When I talk to my my counterparts there, I mean, they almost have to beg people to move there, right? I mean, so in some ways we may be similar, in other ways we're not, right? So,
Yeah.
So make sure we're comparing apples to apples, or at least what we are comparing ourselves to make sure it makes sense.
I think that's exactly.
And I'm an accountant, so I am conservative by nature, okay?
Mass housing was where a lot of this came from as well.
It's much more closer to us, but
right. Many of the right. So we've tried to we did recent study on loan servicing for Rhode Island. We worked for altogether 26 of the state housing finance agencies. So we've tried to draw on those tools that seem like they've worked in contexts which would be similar to yours. We recognize there are always going to be differences, both housing differences, but also structural differences in the indenture. So we've tried to and
maybe you can follow up in a memo something. I don't want to want to take up the time now.
Okay, thank you, George. I think it's time. Thank you to all the board members. And if you have any concrete questions after the meeting, you have the PowerPoint presentation, let us know. You can send me an email to me, Hazin, Nandini, so that we can get you answers. Very excited again. Hazin, you have a lot to work with. So we need a really nice plan. Yep, you went on vacation now. But thank you both.
Refresh.
And thank you, Jane and Tim. This was great.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Okay.